Sergeant Collier's accusations, mingled with Mrs. Pennyworth's hateful words, played again and again in my head. You can't make it, Johnson. Admit it, you're too stupid. What made you think you could succeed in the United States Air Force? Talk about dumb. After several hours, I fell asleep, only to be startled awake by the shrill pre-dawn blast of revelry. Clothes and epithets flew as everyone in the flight unit scurried to meet the staff sergeant's deadline. Okay, Terry, I ordered. This is a new day. We start again. Keep a low profile. Don't do anything to attract Sergeant Collier's attention. I bent down to tie the laces on my Nike sneakers when the sergeant sounded. We're going to do a shakedown search. Put all your belongings on your bed. Dump your bags. The sergeant stood in the aisle, legs spread, thumbs gripping his belt buckle. If any of you yahoos were dumb enough to bring along any drugs or weapons, don't try to hide them. Sergeant Collier emerged from his quarters and joined the other sergeant in the search. As I unzipped my luggage, I sighed with relief. I knew I hadn't brought along any weapons or drugs from home. My relief lasted less than a minute. I do hope none of you are religious nuts. We had one in the last flight. He used his religion to get out of work whenever he could. I won't tolerate any stuff like that again. No excuses. Got it? I gulped and shot a hurried glance toward my suitcases. Before leaving home, I asked my mother to pack some reading material and a Bible for me. Every Christian mother's dream request. Knowing my mother's tendency for overkill, I cautiously dumped the contents of my bag onto the bunk. Out rambled scores of books. Steps to Christ, The Conflict of the Ages set, magazines and Bibles, all religious. Bless you, Mother, I mumbled, rushing to gather them up. I glanced about hurriedly, looking for a place I could stuff them under the bed, in the footlocker, in my jacket pockets, anywhere. My frenzy caught Collier's attention. From the far end of the barracks, he shouted, Stop right there, Slick. What are you trying to hide? Got some drugs you were hoping we wouldn't discover, eh? I rolled my eyes toward the ceiling and threw up my hands in surrender. So much for keeping a low profile. Like a condor, swooping down at his prey, Collier descended. He grabbed the handful of books from my grasp. Oh no, not again. Another religious nutcase. Get this scum out of my sight. The training instructor stormed up the aisle and into his office. By the shattering vibration of the smoked glass in the slammed door, I knew the 6 weeks of training were going to seem a long, long time. Perhaps when he learned I was a Seventh-day Adventist, he would dismiss me immediately. My instincts were not far from wrong. From that day on, Sergeant Collier singled me out for every form of ridicule known to a military inductee. If there was a nasty job to do, I did it. I had dishpan hands and toilet bowl elbows. My knees grew calluses, not only from the chores I did, but also from praying for relief. More often than not, when I returned from breakfast, I'd find my carefully made bunk turned upside down and my locker dumped. Collier followed his actions with taunts. If it's too much for you, Johnson, quit. Go home to Mama. The Air Force isn't for wimps like you. To make matters worse, the more he harassed me, the clumsier I became, and the more mistakes I made. I became the laughing stock of my unit. My inability to march drew so much attention in the squad that they dubbed me Gomer, after the Gomer Pyle character on television. Even my buddies called me Gomer occasionally. Most of the time, I could handle the good nature harassing from my peers, and I understood Collier's attitude toward me. I knew that the staff sergeant wanted me to get angry, to blow up. This would give him excuse to write me up. My counter strategy was to do everything with cheerfulness and dignity. I resolved to be the happiest, most cooperative flyboy Sergeant Collier had ever seen. And for the most part, my positive attitude worked. This baffled Collier more than a display of temper ever could. One evening, after a particularly grueling day on the parade ground, I thought I'd come to the end of my endurance. I believed I could take no more. Was I ever wrong? The military behavior code for the mess hall is strict and precise. The purpose of the discipline is to teach the recruits teamwork and obedience. To be certain that military etiquette was maintained, the training instructors would sit and drink coffee at a long, elevated table called the snake pit and watch the recruits. Even surrounded by his peers, Sergeant Collier still managed to stand out as the toughest and meanest of the crew. I didn't realize that Collier had learned my evening routine of hitting the salad bar immediately after going through the regular food line. My buddy and I had just completed the number of airmen required to fill a table and had sat down when Collier bawled, "Johnson, hurry it up! You're taking too long. Get your salad and sit down." My face grew hot. My collar felt as if it would choke the very life out of me. I could sense the sympathetic glances of my peers as well as a few nervous snickers. My buddy glanced toward me and nodded. He'd go with me to the salad bar as required. When we reached the bar, I filled my plate with lettuce and various other vegetables. Flustered with the sergeant's undue attention, I made the mistake of stepping behind the salad bar to reach one of the condiment bowls. The instant my foot landed behind the salad bar, I heard Collier shout my name. "Johnson!" I froze. "What do you think you're doing? Do you think this is Wendy's or something?" The other training instructors burst into laughter at his jokes. At his joke. "You think you can come in here and just help yourself? Get over here, flyboy." The sergeant waved me toward the snake pit. I held my salad bowl with both hands to control my shaking as I approached the long, fearsome table. In front of Collier, I stared at the squadron symbol mounted above the TI's table. One of the rules was that the recruits could not look at the training instructor's table. Under my breath, I prayed as I'd never prayed before. The sergeant bent over the table and bellowed into my face. I could feel the words vibrate against my chest. "Don't you ever go behind the salad bar again. Got that?" Terrified, I nodded my head and said, "Okay, sir." I cringed as the word "okay" escaped my mouth. The room grew silent. A thousand eyes stared as the staff sergeant straightened to his towering height. With determined step, Collier strode around the long table to where I stood. With hands on his hips, his chin jutting forward and the brim of his Smokey the Bear hat almost touching my forehead, he said, "Okay, okay? What did you say, Slick? Not yes, sir, or no, sir, but okay, sir?" I was so flustered that I compounded my mistake by dropping my tray down on the training instructor's table in order to snap to attention. Collier's ice blue eyes filled with rage. What? Did you put your tray on our table? Don't you know you're not supposed to do that? The man leaned forward, the rim of his hat scraping against my perspiring brow. Do you understand me, Slick? Okay, sir. My eyes shot open wider as I realized I had done it again. Disbelief swept across Collier's face. What did you say? He turned toward his peers and asked, Did you hear that? Quick as a wink, I was surrounded by training instructors, the rims of their hats ringing the circumference of my head. Did you really hear him say that? Four training instructors shouted so loudly I couldn't make any sense of their words. Inside my head, I screamed, I've got to get out of here. Run, run. Instinctively, I backed away. Are you trying to walk away when your TI is talking to you? I closed my eyes. Oh Lord, I'm through. This is it. I know I'm finished. The verbal attack continued for several minutes. Why is this happening, Lord? I've tried to do everything you would have me do. After a 10-minute barrage, the four training instructors turned and walked away. They stopped the harassment because they could no longer contain their laughter. I picked up my food tray and hurried to my table, my hands shaking so badly that the dishes clattered against one another, the way they would during a Santa Monica earthquake. By the time I reached my table, acid was rumbling in my stomach. I couldn't swallow a bite of food. Military etiquette demanded I wait to leave the mess hall until the others at my table finished their meals. So I sat in silence, staring at the food before me and analyzing the shards of my illustrious but short military career. As soon as I could do so, I rushed upstairs to my unit. I needed to get away, to be alone. I felt the way Mount St. Helens must have felt seconds before it erupted in Portland's backyard. Could one person say the wrong thing to me? Should one person say the wrong thing to me, I'd spew forth a river of hot lava I'd later regret. Once I reached my footlocker, I grabbed my Bible and headed toward the door of the barracks. When I heard a voice from the other side of the room, Tough luck, Johnson. How'd you keep from popping that guy one right in the nose? I cast the cadet a crooked grin. The idea crossed my mind. I don't know how you put up with all the hassle that guy gives you. If it were me, I'd be on the next flight home. I nodded. I've considered that too. You're a whole lot stronger than I am. Not really, I gulped, knowing the thoughts I'd been thinking. It's not me. I held up my Bible. Any strength I have comes from here. I suppressed my anger for a time while we talked. When I could finally escape, I called home. My mother answered the phone. At the sound of her voice, couldn't hold back my tears. I spilled out my horrid tale to her. When I finished, she asked, Do you still believe God's led you into the service? I mumbled a reluctant yes. When I enlisted, I had no doubts that God had supplied a way I could go to college without the heavy tuition costs that most 4-year colleges demanded. Do you think he's changed his mind now? Because things have gotten a little difficult? I knew where she was leading, and I didn't like it. I wanted sympathy, not logic. Remember your third grade teacher, Mrs. Sherlock? Mrs. Sherlock? The teacher who'd been haunting my mind was Mrs. Pennyworth, not Mrs. Sherlock. Remember how often you wanted to quit when she was trying to teach you to read? You'd come home from school and say, I can't do it, Mommy. I can't. Yes, I remembered. Of course I remembered. The ordeal was something I could never forget, no matter how long I lived. After my mother received the letter from my school guidance counselor advising her to put me in a state home for mentally challenged children for the next 10 years, she began calling schools around the country. She considered having me live with relatives if necessary. When she'd exhausted all her leads, my mother talked with the public school principal, Mr. Bates. Mr. Bates helped her enroll me in a small Christian school near where I lived. That's when I met the indomitable Mrs. Sherlock, a determined teacher who refused to accept defeat from anyone in anything. Mrs. Sherlock decided I would learn to read, and read I would. First, she switched me from reading by phonics to reading to sight reading. She used pictures with words. Each day, she assigned chapters of the Bible for my homework, then quizzed me over what I read. Half the time, I had no idea, but she refused to give up on me. She kept me after school to work individually with me. Every time I said I can't, she'd reply, "Yes, you can. With God, you can do anything." Then to reinforce her message, she had me memorize promises from the Bible, promises such as, "Nothing is impossible with God. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. I can do everything through him who gives me strength." Because of my past, my natural inclination was to think negatively. I was comfortable with failure. Sitting in the back of the room and coloring was much easier than trying to tame a bunch of unruly letters on a page. But Mrs. Sherlock told me that if I believed the negative labels, my fight was already over. The only way I could overcome both the negative thought patterns and my reading problem was to break the old habits. She said, "The words 'I can't' must be drilled out of your vocabulary and replaced with God's help, 'I can.'" Now, I grew up in a Christian home. My mother read the Bible to us. I'd heard the same positive promises many times, but they never really sank in until I began to memorize them. The more I thought about these verses, the more I believed that maybe they were meant for people like me. Through grade school and academy, other teachers added to Mrs. Sherlock's training by taking individual time with me, including Mrs. Brooks, my English teacher, at Portland Adventist Elementary School, Mrs. Winters, my English teacher at Portland Adventist Academy, and Pastor Matula, my Academy religion teacher. They worked to strengthen my reading and public speaking skills, as well as my confidence in myself and God. And all the way, my mother continued to support me, to tell me, "Terry, you can do anything you set your mind to." Slowly, I practiced what my mother and these educators preached. I resisted the temptation to say I can't. I read books on positive thinking, as difficult as reading was for me. These books included several by Robert Schuller. The possibility thinking Schuller once said, "Most people fail, not because they lack talent, money, or opportunity. They fail because they never really plan to succeed." I determined not to quit at anything. Situations that helped me begin to see beyond the labels I accrued came along. When I was in the fourth grade, I came home from church one day and saw the county dog catcher across the street on my best friend's lawn, trying to take his dog. Now, every boy in the neighborhood had a dog, and the dogs usually stayed on their own property. I was indignant. Here was the county dog catcher trying to take my best friend's dog. He even used a dog treat to catch the dog. How could the dog catcher trespass on somebody's property and take that person's dog? I yelled, "Run, Prince, run!" Prince darted around the corner of the house and out of the dog catcher's reach. If the dog catcher could threaten to take Prince, he could take any of our dogs. I asked my dad what I could do about it. He suggested I write to the city mayor. Me? Write to the mayor? A fourth grader considered mentally challenged by the state of Oregon writing a letter of protest to the mayor of Portland? Mad enough to ignore the cants, I didn't stop with a letter to the mayor. I also wrote a letter to Senator Mark Hatfield. My letters made me a neighborhood hero because soon after, the mayor and the senator wrote letters to me promising to look into the practice I described. Later, they reported back to me their findings and their steps to correct the situation. I realized I wasn't a total dud. Mayors and United States senators didn't write letters to dummies. I could make a difference. Along with this knowledge, I realized I had a keen interest in politics. It was a way I could help people. My interest in politics grew with the presidential race between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. A fourth grade teacher wanted the class to learn about the democratic process, so she drew names out of a hat. I was chosen to represent Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter? Everyone laughed. No way you're going to win, Terry. No one likes Carter. We all want President Ford to win. Only 7 in the class of more than 20 claimed to be for Jimmy Carter. What could I do? I decided I needed an edge. I wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter. I told him that I was in charge of his campaign in my class and that no one wanted to vote for him. I asked him for a list of reasons that would change their minds. I asked him for what he would do differently if he were president. To everyone's surprise, I received a personal letter from Mr. Carter. He explained why he wanted to be President of the United States and how he thought he could affect the future. The school principal called me to read the letter before the entire student assembly. When we held our classroom election, Jimmy Carter received 25 of the 27 votes. With this fragile background of wins, I continued throughout my school years to fight the desire to quit. I joined the Air Force expecting to escape my past until I came up against the toughest, meanest, fightingest training instructor in the United States Air Force. I didn't realize that Sergeant Collier had specifically chosen me to be his fall guy. He told the other sergeants that he planned to break me down. I didn't learn this fact until after the mess hall fiasco. One evening, as I folded my freshly washed laundry, Collier called me into his office. Oh no, I thought. What did I do now? I dragged my feet as I headed toward his open door, searching my memory for any mistakes I had inadvertently made. Outside of this encounter in the cafeteria, I could think of nothing. The fact that I couldn't tell my right foot from my left continued to give me hassle. But beyond that, nothing. Terrified, I marched into the office and snapped off a salute before Collier's desk. Closed the door. Airman Johnson reports as ordered, sir. Collier sighed. Forget the military, Johnson. At ease. Take a seat. We're just going to talk. Yes, sir. My heels snapped against each other. All the at ease commands he might give couldn't put my body or mind at ease. My stomach churned, anticipating his newest scathing rebuke. Forget the military, Johnson, he said once more. We're just going to talk. Right, I thought. A stun gun squaring off with a pop gun, and I had no doubt who was about to get popped. Lowering myself into the straight back wooden chair in front of his desk, I opened my mind to the possibility that Sergeant Collier had finally found the excuse he needed to send me home. The sergeant sat down behind his desk. Before speaking, he cleared his throat, moved the letter opener from one side of his desk pad to the other, then straightened a stack of memos. Johnson, I have a confession to make to you. During the past 3 weeks, I've done everything I could to break you. Oh, really? Surprise, surprise, I thought. And that's news? My mouth tightened into an overstitched seam. I've been way out of line. He cleared his throat. I wouldn't blame you if you walked right down those stairs and reported me. I blinked. I can't stand it any longer. The rougher I've been on you, the more cheerful you've behaved. He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. What is it? Why are you so happy all the time? What's your secret? I swallowed in surprise. This was the last thing I expected to hear when I entered the office. I wondered if I should tell him. Should I answer his questions honestly, knowing that he wouldn't like what he was about to hear? Tell me, Johnson, I made your life miserable. How do you do it? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I prayed a quick prayer, put the right words in my mouth. Leaning forward in the chair, I said, God, that's who made it possible. God. God? He shook his head in disgust. Come on, Johnson, fess up. What really helped you keep your cool? God. I shrugged. God. Collier studied my face for several minutes before speaking. Johnson, I did everything I could to break you. You know, you could get me into a lot of trouble for telling you for me telling you all this. You know, you could get me into a lot of trouble for telling you all this, but it's true. And you never lost your cool. One swing at me and I'd have sent you packing. Worst of all, he pounded his fists on the desktop. I can't help liking you. You and your attitude. Stunned, I stared at the man who made my life so miserable. As he spoke, the hurt and resentment welled up inside of me. Yes, I'd turn him in. I'd get even. How I'd love to see him swing from the yardarm, to see him blowing in the wind, reprimanded for the way he had treated me. Then Collier's words stopped me mid-thought. You're the genuine article, the real thing, a real Christian. A real Christian? Whoops. Suddenly I couldn't report the sergeant for what he'd done. I dropped my head, embarrassed for the thoughts I had been having. Collier explained that he'd taken a lot of harassment from his fellow training instructors during the last flight training because a couple of guys who called themselves Christians, they used their religion to get out of doing anything unpleasant. And I vowed I'd never again become a patsy for a so-called Christian. If I could get the rest of the troops to adopt your good attitude, we'd win flight honors at graduation. Every unit and every training instructor in Lackland Air Force Base coveted the flight honors. How would you like to be the unit chaplain for the rest of the training program? I gulped. What would that entail, sir? You'll still perform all the rest of your training obligations, but you'd also function as a sort of morale officer to the rest of the guys. I smiled to myself. Whether the man realized it or not, I had already become that. His ridicule and abuse had made me a natural listening ear to the other men's complaints. When one of the men felt lonely or frustrated or needed personal advice, more often than not he asked me for help. The difference now would be that I would have a title for what I was doing. I'd like you to try to get the men to attend the base chapel each week. You'll be in charge of the flight on Sunday. Wear this when you march the men to church services. He handed me an armband. I can't believe I'm doing this. Me? Encouraging base chapel attendance? And of course, you can go to church every Saturday. In the days that followed, me marching didn't improve. My marching didn't improve. And I still couldn't shoot straight enough to connect with the target board. Sergeant Collier continued to dress me down whenever I made mistakes. But knowing my training instructor was on my side made all the difference to me. I thought about my mother's constant streams of prayers. She'd had the entire church congregation praying for me, and her wise advice on maintaining a positive attitude. I had to admit, she'd been so right. By canning the cants, God and I had tamed the fearsome Sergeant Collier.